Hi, I'm Joel Sutherland with the Evangelism Ministries of the Georgia Baptist Convention. I'm joined today by my co-workers Steve Parr and Mark Merritt, and we're here to talk about some research that was recently done to help pastors and churches be more evangelistic. Steve, why don't you take a moment and talk about this research, Georgia's top evangelistic churches?
Love to, Joel. Recently, we studied Georgia's churches and identified the 100 most effective evangelistic churches. Now, what was interesting, these are not the top 100 churches in baptisms. We broke it down into categories. Smaller congregations, those who average less than 125 in worship, the top 25. And then that intermediate group that averaged between like 125 and 250 in worship. And then that medium-sized group, 250 to 500. And then the large churches, 500 plus. So what's interesting is the 100 churches we studied are all size churches. And what was great about that, once we identified those churches, they were from every part of our state, north, south, east, west, suburban, rural, urban. So we got a really good cross-section of churches in regard to style and size and geography, and then we compiled that information together. We interviewed all the pastors, and 80% of the pastors responded. And after that was over, as we began to look at that information together as a staff, 15 things stood out to us. And then we began to realize there was some redundancy there, so we kind of consolidated it, narrowed it down to 10 lessons from our most effective evangelistic churches.
So to the best of your ability, through the process, there's no bias in this process. So a South Georgia rural church or an urban Metro Atlanta church or a suburban church, they all can benefit from this information.
Yeah, and that's true on two ends. First, this is not what we think works. This is what the Georgia churches told us works in their church, and it's the trends, what's working, among them. And then the other thing, it doesn't matter what part of the state you're in, there are principles. And I would even add, if somebody's watching this who does not live in Georgia, there are some principles that are true. It doesn't matter where you live, and that's one thing that really came through very strong. There are certain things that you need to be doing if you're going to be effective in your evangelistic emphasis.
One of the things I noticed when I read through the material, none of this material is dependent upon style of church. These are really core principles that are found in a church.
Joel, that was a very interesting insight you just made. When we studied these churches and we asked the questions, style was never the issue. I think quality may be an issue many times.
Sure.
The quality of your worship and quality, not being perfect or having a lot of resources, but doing a good job with what you've got. And based on the community where you live, I think people appreciate that. But you're right. Interestingly, style was not the issue. There were contemporary churches, there were traditional churches, there were blended churches, innovative churches, those who were very structured. So all styles of churches made up the information that you're about to consider right now.
Great. So before we dive into the 10, because that's what we want to spend our time on, Mark, why don't you speak to the fact on a pastor who's watching these videos, what does he do with this information?
Well, I think it can be used in two ways. Number one, for evaluation, and number two, for effectiveness. For evaluation, I think every pastor desires to do a good job in the area of evangelism. We want to be evangelistic churches. We want to be soul winners. We want to train and equip our people to be evangelistic and to be soul winners. But many times we don't know where to start. We look at our own baptism and we're not satisfied with how many people we're reaching in our community. And we can use this book to evaluate where we are at as a church. Second, we can use it to help us be more effective. There are 10 principles here. We can apply one or two of these principles and be a little more effective as a church, or we can apply 7 or 8 of these principles and be a lot more effective, or we can apply all 10 and really reach more people in our community with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So evaluation and effectiveness, I think, would help any pastor. So
this is not a video, Mark, that you think a pastor ought to watch all by himself and never break it out and show other people. This is really a group effort.
Absolutely. The church leadership team should sit down together and watch this and go over these 10 principles and understand and catch this vision, everyone at the same time. Okay.
I'm going to show you the book, and then we'll show you where a free download is available, and we'll put that on the screen at the end of the lesson. So guys, let's dive right in. Lesson number 1. I'll read the lesson and then I'll read the principle and let you guys say some commentary about it. Lesson number 1, evangelistic churches are intentional in their approach. Steve.
We did not necessarily put these in a priority order. However, if we did, this is the number one priority, intentionality. And again, this comes through in a lot of research you see about churches that are effective in evangelism. One of the questions we asked was, tell us how your church is different from the other Southern Baptist churches in your community. And the intent there is not to be negative, but just what is different, because they all have Sunday school or small groups, they all have worship services, they all, they do a lot alike, but how are you different? And the thing that came up over and over again is that we are more intentional in our evangelism, or we're more aggressive in evangelism, we're more purposeful about evangelism. That came up over and over. Evangelistic churches don't just stumble into evangelism. Now, certainly God is good, and He shows up many times. But it's interesting how He tends to show up a whole lot more where the pastors are leading their congregation to be purposeful in the things we're talking about, in reaching out to the community and sowing those seeds. So intentionality, in other words, being purposeful. Spontaneity is good, but what's the plan? What's the strategy? Right. These churches have a strategy. They're purposeful. They're intentional about their evangelism, not just as pastors, but with the entire congregation.
So, to elaborate on that a little bit, it's not really a lay person that's intentionally evangelistic. That helps, and that's great. You're talking about pastors leading their church to be intentionally evangelistic.
That would be true, and you're going to see with the very next lesson, that was the key. You got to be intentional. If you're intentional, that implies somebody is leading the congregation to be intentional. Who is that person? And so lesson 2 addresses that very issue.
Okay, so when you're talking about intentionality in evangelism, are you saying it has to be a meeting at a table where we put together a strategy? Is that the kind of thing that we're speaking about?
Well, it sure doesn't hurt to have a gathering, and when I say a gathering with staff or key leaders, at least one time to say, okay, in the next 12 months, what are we going to do in the area of personal evangelism? How are we going to train our members? What are 2 or 3 services where we can really ramp up the number of guests present, like Easter Sunday, Mother's Day, with the intention of sharing the gospel? What are 2 or 3 or 4 evangelistic events we could have that would attract the unchurched, either to our property or where we could go off the property and attract the unchurched? Well, those things take planning. You can't just do those next week.
Right.
So you would do well to sit down with a group. Now, a pastor can do it by himself, and he can lead the way, but you get buy-in when you bring other people to the table.
Mm-hmm. So, lesson 1, be intentional in your evangelism.
Exactly.
All right. Lesson number 2, we've talked about it a little bit already. Lesson number 2 states, the pastor's influence is elevated in evangelistic churches.
It's true. You ask about the intentionality. Somebody has to lead the way. Key point. Evangelistic churches are led by evangelistic pastors. But I'll encourage our pastors who may be watching, and you may not feel you have gifts in evangelism. I'm thinking of Timothy. Paul wrote to him and said, do the work of an evangelist. He didn't say, Timothy, you're doing a great job in evangelism.
Right.
He didn't say, Timothy, you're a wonderful evangelist. He said, Timothy, do the work of an evangelist. I talk about the squeaky wheel principle. The squeaky wheel always gets the grease. Pastors continually have crises that they're dealing with, people having either medical situations, family counseling issues, crises in the community. Plus, he's got to be preparing 2, 3, 4 sermons, Bible studies each week. Plus, he certainly has family obligations and just day-to-day life. The squeaky wheel gets his attention. But I'd like to ask pastors this question. How many people called you this week and asked if you could come over and share with them how they could know Christ as their Savior? Mm-hmm. People are calling us about everything else.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So since the squeaky wheel is getting the grease, we've got to be aware of that. We've got to be intentional, again, go back to the intentionality about being evangelistic. We've got to do the work of an evangelist. So every pastor needs to learn to be evangelistic, and that's what a pastor's doing by watching this video. They're learning how to be more evangelistic. We ask about things that influenced evangelism, and we made a list of things, and it's interesting how preaching came out as one of the very top things, and that's very consistent with other research also. Preaching is integral to good evangelism. Not only good evangelistic preaching, but good preaching where your community and congregation want to invite friends to come to the preaching,
right.
Where people are hearing the gospel declared. So preaching's important. And we also found out some things about the tenure of pastors, which I thought was interesting. Mark, tell them about that.
Well, I thought it was very interesting. Nationally, 3.8 years is the average tenure of a pastor. But these most effective evangelistic churches, the pastor usually has tenure of around 10 years, which tells us he has really stuck through some tough times and worked through some difficult times in order to have that influence where he can lead his church to be more evangelistic. So I would encourage pastors not to leave and to stay and to build and to work on evangelism right where you're at.
It would be true that a climate of evangelism takes time to develop inside of a church.
And that plays back to the tenure. It doesn't happen the first month. It may. Maybe you got a just very charismatic, personality-wise pastor who just rallies the troops. Sometimes, though, and many times I think, it's a matter of you build relationships. And that congregation just loves and respects you so much, they'll go to battle for you.
That's right.
And when you say we need to do a community evangelism project, they, Pastor, whatever you say, because of the relationship that you have with them. So you can do it based on your charisma, but most people have to do it based on the relationships they develop over time.
Right, right. And I want to say this, maybe a word of confession or what, I was never the best soul winner in the churches I pastored. And some of that's just pastoral. You're dealing with the crises, you're putting out the fires, you're doing marriage counseling, all the other. Our congregation lives around the lost people, and so my wife led more people to Christ than anybody in our church did. But in her secular job, she was around a lot of people like that. And I say that to say this, that leadership doesn't mean you have to be the best soul winner, but in your preaching and in your leadership, you're the one that has to elevate the topic in your church. Is that correct?
And I'd agree, and I'd feel the same way, Joel. I was always known in every church I've served, whether on staff or as interim pastor, of being evangelistic, although I don't consider myself the most evangelistic person, but I do the work of the evangelist. And I think the key for me is I've always been intentional.
Right.
I've never sat around waiting on it to happen. I've been thinking ahead 2 and 3 and 4 months. How am I going to lead my congregation? How am I going to lead my leaders to do this?
Right, right. And that's the leadership approach to it.
Absolutely.
All right, lesson number 3. You've been viewing a portion of this subject. Please go to the website and navigate to the next video in this training series.